Hey everyone, welcome to SingularityComputers Client Build 5 Part 3, and this system is called Nighthawk. This part of the build log is going to be focused mainly on the mounting of the radiators. At the end of Part 2 I said that I was going to be modding the case, and I left you guys guessing as to where I was going to be mounting a third radiator. Now, as I've explained in previous videos, when I build a system I leave most of the process as dynamic, because I like to see the components together before I decide if I'm actually going to use them, where I'm going to put them in the case, all of that. What I focus on when I build a system is performance, and performance out of the components, also out of the water cooling system, instead of doing things that are often unnecessary and just to make the system look pretty. Because a lot of the time that is what modding is about. When it comes down to it, it is of course all about what the client wants me to build. This doesn't mean that you're not going to be seeing modding on my channel. Modding certainly has its place. It's just that in this system I've found another way. Like in Part 2 when I mounted the pumps and the reservoir. Modding would have been the easy option because I would have then just been able to drill the holes exactly where I needed them. Instead, I found a way of using the existing holes in the case, and in doing that it meant that the client was able to put those funds that they would have put into modding the case into getting more performance out of the system. So now I need to go right back and explain to you why I'm mounting a third radiator into this system. Originally I was planning to mount two Black Ice GTX Extreme radiators side by side in the bottom compartment. A 560mm and a 280mm. It turns out that the 280mm radiator was too thick because the GTX Extremes are 54mm thick, and I couldn't get the fittings in between the two radiators because, as you might be able to imagine, I need to run tubing down to the 560 and then back across to the 280. So there wasn't enough room for the fittings. Also, I needed to change it down to a 240mm radiator because there wasn't enough room for the power supply and the power supply cables. So because of this downsizing of the radiator, I decided to give the client the option to mount a third radiator. And when I decided to do this, I had two places that I was going to mount it. One of them was the 5.25-inch base, and the other one was this position here at the back. Now, mounting the radiator into the 5.25-inch base requires absolutely no modding, but mounting it here means that I need to cut out a rectangular piece, mount the radiator on the inside with the fans, and I was going to put a grill on the outside. So I measured it all up, and it turns out that everything fit. So I was going to go ahead with this. And that's when I said to you guys at the end of Part 2 of the build log that there was going to be some modding. I was going to be mounting a third radiator, all of that. But then it came to the point where I mounted all the water blocks on the motherboard, and I decided to see how things were going to look. So I put the motherboard into the system, I mounted some fans onto the radiator, I sat the radiator into position, and everything was just way too cramped. It certainly fit, but basically the radiator and the fans were overhanging the motherboard. And I knew they would do that, but I didn't realize just how much. And because of the amount of water blocks on this motherboard, this is really the main feature of the build. It's going to be the center, the heart of the build. So why would I go cover it up, with a radiator and some fans? Because they were basically, coming right up over the memory blocks, almost completely covering the MOSFET water block. So I could have actually got around this problem by using a shroud and mounting the fans inside of the shroud and the radiator on the inside, but a shroud would have been too wide for the back of the case, and it also would have been protruding at the top, and it would have just made the system look weird. So yeah, I decided that wasn't a good idea either. So I decided to go back to the other position that I had in mind, the 5.25-inch bays. So those of you who guessed the back panel of the case and the 5.25-inch bays, Gold stars for all of you guys. That's all you get though. Mounting a radiator into this position has been made really easy by these brackets made by UN. You'll be seeing exactly how these work shortly, but basically they sit into position like that and hold the radiator into the 5.25 inch bays. Okay, now it's time to mount the radiators. So I've already mounted the 560mm radiator, and I'm just going to explain how I did this. I was going to drill holes in the bottom panel of the case, and I even dismantled part of the case and removed the bottom panel. I measured everything out, and then I realized that I could just use the UN mounts and the existing holes in the case, because the 560mm radiator actually fits in there really tightly. Thanks to the phobia stripping that I've used, you can see it there underneath the radiator, and I've also used it on top of the radiator. You can see it just there. I actually just used it so that the radiator would slide into position without scratching the case or the radiator. But yeah, it holds it in there really tightly. It's actually difficult to move the radiator around even without the mounts. So the radiator is certainly not going to tilt. Tilt is not something that I have to worry about because it's got the flat panel, you know, down on the bottom and the flat panel hard up on the top of the bottom compartment as well. So the only thing I need to stop is the radiator from sliding side to side. So I've also installed the Silverstone 1500 watt strider, and I'm just going to show you how I've mounted the radiator at the back. So you can see I have it mounted to the top here, whereas at the front I have it mounted at the bottom. I've used the UN mount again at the back here, and that is how it's sitting inside of the case. So I've mounted to the radiator through this hole where my thumb is, and I've mounted through this hole to the back panel here. So that is actually an Allen key bolt, and obviously I couldn't get an Allen key on the inside to tighten it, so I had to use a spring washer to stop it from rotating. Now I've faced the power supply fan towards the radiator. The radiator fans are blowing extra air straight into the power supply, and you might think that this may heat up the power supply, but in a build with plenty of radiator capacity like this one, the air coming out of the radiators is only ever lukewarm, so that's definitely not going to be a problem. As you can see, the other thing that I've done at this point is installed the two Kingston HyperX 240GB SSDs. I've also now installed the optical drive. It's actually a Pioneer Blu-ray drive, and this is another one of the components that the client gave me from their old build. I have also now installed the Lambtron FC5 V2 fan controller. So now that I've mounted the 560mm radiator, it's time for me to mount the two 240mm radiators. The final radiator configuration in this system is 3 black ice radiators, a 560mm GT Gen 2 Extreme, and two 240mm GT Gen 2 Stealths. One of them is going in the bottom compartment and the other one in the 5.25 inch bays. Okay, now for a quick look at the GT Gen 2 Stealth 240mm radiator. This radiator has a 30 FPI, which is about as high as it gets. And some of you might think that that's excessive and that you may need an incredibly loud fan to push any air through this radiator. But that is not the case. This fin array actually looks, to me, exactly the same as the fin array on the GT Extreme, which has a 20 FPI. So that's 10 fins per inch lower than this, but it looks the same. And I think it's because these fins are thinner. This radiator also has dual rows of fins per channel, so this fin array is designed for extreme performance. You can see the paint job is gloss black, G1 1/4 inch threads here as always, M4 threads for mounting, and you can see those plates underneath the mounting holes to protect the radiator from being pierced. This radiator is 29.6mm thick, but because of the incredibly high FPI, maintains decent performance. Just to give you an idea, the 560mm GTX is rated by Black Ice at 2400 watts, and this radiator is rated at 700 watts. So considering the size difference between the two radiators, this radiator gets incredible performance for the form factor. Now for a look at the fans that I'm using on the two 240mm radiators. So these are Noise Blocker Black Silent Pro PL2s to match up with the other Noise Blocker fans that I've used in the build. These are a 120mm fan, and I'll just give you a look at the specifications. 1400 RPM, 1.269 static pressure, 56.5 CFM, and 11 decibels minimum. Now you will get a good look at these fans once I've installed them onto the radiators, and they also look exactly the same as the Noise Blocker fans that I showed you earlier in the build log, and they also come with the same accessories. Okay, I've installed the fans, grills and fittings onto the GTS 240s. I'm just going to give you a look at one of them because I've configured both of them the same. The aesthetics are great. The gloss black fan blades match up with the gloss black paint jobs on the radiators. I've used all black bolts and washers to match up. So I've got the grills on this side to protect the fans. Just give you a look from the side. And I have grills on the other side to protect the radiator fins. So you can see I've just used straight compression fittings on this radiator because this is the one that's going into the 5.25 inch bays. I'm now going to show you how I've configured the fittings on the other GTS 240, which is going into the bottom compartment. So I've used a 20mm extension fitting and a 90-degree dual rotary. I've used dual rotaries because I'm not sure how I'm going to be angling the tubings, because I can rotate these so that these fittings point up that way or back down. Okay, I'm just about to mount the 240mm radiator into the bottom compartment. I have phobia stripping on top of the radiator because the top of the radiator is going to be sitting up against the bottom of this panel. I've got this tube as short as I possibly can to still be able to connect it to this radiator. So these fittings are all ready to go. This one will go to the 560, this one will go to this tube, which I have all ready to go, which goes up between the power supply and the 560. That will probably go up to the CPU water block. So I'm using UN mounts. You can just see them here and here. I've bolted on the UN mounts with M3s. There's one there, and there's another one just there. Okay, the radiator is mounted. It was a little bit difficult to get into position, mainly because of the tube that runs between this radiator and the 560. It actually took a couple of goes to get it to the right length. So I wasn't happy with not being able to see between the two radiators, you know, to see how everything ended up. Normally I've got line of sight, you know, in other builds, or I can get my hand in there to feel where everything is. But in this build, there wasn't even enough room to get my hand around there. So I wasn't happy with that and decided to get this little mirror and have a good look around there just to make sure that the fittings are pointing in the right directions, the tubing isn't twisted or squashed, that the wiring is all positioned correctly, that there's nothing poking into the fins or the fans, you know, on the radiators, all of that kind of thing. So I've had a good look, everything is positioned correctly, and yeah, it's all done. So I had to pull this tube that I had down here ready to go back out of the way to get the radiator in. I removed the extension fitting that I had here. I had a 20mm extension fitting. That won't be necessary. It's only necessary at the top here to get the fitting up over the fans. The distance from the fans to the 560 here, it's about 50mm, but the distance from the top of the fitting to the 560 is only 10mm, so the gap is very small between the fittings and the next radiator. So you can see the two UN mounts here and here, and I've just bolted straight through those, through the grills and into the radiator. So the radiator is suspended about 10 millimeters off the bottom of the case, and I'm really happy with the way this is mounted. You know, there is only 2 mounts and it might look flimsy, but it's certainly not. So yeah, I think it looks good. Once the side panel is on, it comes very close, and I actually had to turn the grills around. You can see that they're not protruding, they're facing the other way. Okay, as you can see, I already have this radiator in position. It was fairly straightforward to mount, so I thought I'd just mount it first and explain it all later. So the gaps on either side of the radiator are about 7 millimeters. I have a gap over the radiator and a large gap underneath the radiator, so airflow is not going to be a problem. Also, air can come in through the holes in the sides here, and because of the large gap that I managed to get between the fans and the bay covers, I've decided that ventilated bay covers are definitely not going to be necessary. This gap is about 80 millimeters. Normally I would still use ventilated bay covers, but airflow in this case is definitely not a problem. These two 180 millimeter fans suck cold air directly from the outside of the case through these ducts, and then the entire top of the case is ventilated so that the hot air can rise out. You can see the UN mounts. There's one in each corner, so you can see 2 nuts and washers there holding them into position. Another one at the bottom there, and then on the other side. So I'll just show you those from the outside. I've just done exactly the same thing on either side of the case. 2 M3s and 2 M3s just there. So this radiator is going to be completely out of sight. I mean, the bay covers will be completely hiding it. You won't be able to see it from the sides. You'll only just be able to see it from the back. So I'm really happy with this radiator mounting position. So just to look from the back, you can see I have the grills protecting the radiator fins. You can see one of the UN mounts just there, so that's how they work. Just bolt straight onto the 5.25 inch bays. Makes it incredibly easy to mount a radiator into this position. Now the gap that I have between the radiator and the pump top is probably 20 millimeters between the actual fins and the pump top. So it's definitely enough of a gap, mainly considering the pump top is fairly narrow. So you can see I can just access the back of the fan controller there to plug all the wiring in. So instead of dropping the radiator down to the bottom of the case and having long tubes going down to it, I've lifted it up to get the shortest possible tubing routing. So it's just going to go, at this point, it's going to come back from the graphics cards to this radiator, out of this radiator and into the reservoir. So you can see the fittings that I have there is a single rotary 90 degree and a dual rotary 90 degree. And I just have to connect up one short tube between those fittings. Okay, I've just installed 3 of the bay covers, and I just thought I'd give you a look at the gap that I have between the radiator and the bay covers. So as you can see, the airflow there is not going to be a problem. So that's it, the radiator is hidden behind the bay covers. Okay, now it's time for me to tube up the motherboard. There's a number of different ways I can go about this, and the only difference between them is aesthetics. I can either go all tubing or all fittings. When I say all tubing, I mean compression fittings and tubing. When I say all fittings, I mean you can actually use bits power crystal link fittings and any other multiple GPU, water cooling fittings, and in combination with these you use multi-link fittings. You can use extension fittings and D-plugs. There's a lot of different fittings out there that you can actually use for this type of thing. Now, the aesthetics going one way or the other are completely different. With tubing, it's high up, off the motherboard, whereas if you go off fittings, you can get it very low profile, and it has a small impact. You can't see very much of it because the length between you know, the actual tubing routing becomes shorter, whereas with the tubing routing becomes longer. And some of you might think that changes the performance, and it might slightly, but just consider if you go all fittings, you have a lot of 90-degree turns. So that kind of chokes the performance a bit, but there's not as far for the coolant to travel. So then when you go all tubing, you know, there's nice curves, so that doesn't slow down the coolant as much, but there's further for the coolant to travel, so then you get the pressure drop again. So either way, I guess it must kind of equal out. The easiest way to do it is to go somewhere in between. So basically you use fittings where you need them, like rotary fittings and 45s and 90s wherever you need them, and then you also use tubing. So that's what I've been experimenting with here, because I still haven't decided. I am going to go for whatever looks best with this configuration. You know, I've got all of these water blocks on the motherboard. This is going to be the main feature of the build, and I want to get it right. So I'm just having a bit of a play around, seeing what looks best. And I mean, tubing looks really busy as well, and I think I've kind of gone busy enough with all of these water blocks. So yeah, I'm more inclined to go for fittings. There's one thing that I want to clear up right now before I go with the Bits Power Crystal Link. And because in my last build I had a lot of comments. You can see that this is a lot smaller than the tubing. This is 1/2 inch, this is 1/4 of an inch. And people were saying, doesn't that choke the loop? Like, what people think is, if you're going to go 1/4 of an inch or a smaller tubing diameter in one little section of the build, they think that you might as well go that diameter in the entire loop, because that's what it brings it down, you know, because it decreases the flow anyway. But that's not the case. This is just the laws of physics here. I'm going to try and explain this as best as I can. When the coolant comes from the 1/2 inch, you know, the larger tubing to the smaller tubing, it doesn't just keep traveling the same speed and decrease in volume. It actually increases in speed. So you end up with the same amount of, you know, the same volume of water traveling through that smaller tube as is traveling through the larger tube, except when it reaches the smaller tube, it just goes faster. It's simple. So it doesn't choke the loop at all. It might impact on performance very slightly, but that is all. Okay guys, I'm going to have to leave it there. That's it for this part of the build log. The reason why I'm stopping here is actually because I've run out of 90-degree fittings. I have more arriving tomorrow, but I'm due to upload this part of the build log. In part 4, I'm going to continue tubing up the motherboard. I'm going to give you a look at the graphics cards with the water block on them, and then I'm going to start wiring up and tubing up. Once I've done that, it's time to fill the loop. So yeah, there's going to be a lot going on in the next part of the build log. There's still a lot to cover. I'd say I'm only about halfway through at this point. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.